Who thinks their parents hold them to a nearly impossible standard? Now, how many of you think you hold your parents to a nearly impossible standard? We all want our parents to be Lorelai from Gilmore Girls, Danny Tanner from Full House, or the parents from Spy Kids. We want the ideal family that we see in the media. But these characters are fictional, and our parents are human. Coming of age is an exercise in recognizing that the world around us and the people in it are not always as picture perfect as we want or expect them to be. That's hard to accept, especially when we experience it with increasing frequency. When I was 11, my world came to a screeching halt because I realized that adults aren't superhuman. They're imperfect, just like us. In fact, I think one of the key struggles of adolescence is navigating the disparity between our expectations of adults and reality. How do we do that? I think the answer is that we have to empathize with the instability we feel with ourselves. We have to empathize with ourselves and the instability we feel when noticing the imperfections of the adults in our lives. We also have to empathize with the adults who we set such high expectations for. Take your parents, for example. When we are young, our parents are superheroes. They tell us what to do. They tell us what not to do. They protect us from the monsters under our beds, and they hold us and hug us when we cry. When we are young, our parents are our compasses. There's safety and comfort in that. As we get older, we start to see small fractures in the idealized portraits we've drawn of our families. For instance, maybe one of your parents always makes you late, or supports political views that you don't really agree with. Or maybe it's just the 14th time you've had to explain how to use Instagram to one of your family members. As more of these moments occur, there are pulls in the costume and rips in the cape. Suddenly, your superhero turns into a colorfully dressed grown-up, trying to figure out how to do the right thing. But back to my moment of epiphany. When I was 11, I had a teacher who we'll call Jeremy. I was excited to be in his class because I had heard terrific things about him. He was a great mediator for our class. When things went sideways, he always knew the best way to get us back on track. He would tell a joke or settle the issue with a compromise. I admired him and his ability to navigate difficult situations. He seemed to have a magic touch that allowed him to fix almost any problem. Until, of course, he couldn't. At some point in the spring, one of our classmates experienced an awful case of cyberbullying. It was a struggle for all of the students in our class to handle. I remember hoping that Jeremy would be able to fix it somehow. But when I looked at him, I could see that he was lost and overwhelmed by the situation. So much so that he did almost nothing at all. In that moment, I realized that he couldn't help us. He simply didn't know how. For a long time, I was upset that he didn't support my classmate. And I was confused about why he couldn't resolve this situation the same way he could everything else. In reflecting back on the event years later, I realized that even those I looked up to and admired were imperfect. This didn't make my teacher a failure. It made him human. In fact, being human means being imperfect. At the time, though, this was a hard pill to swallow. Accepting something so contrary to what we have believed and want to believe about the world is very taxing. I realized that the human experience is built around the relationships that we have with other people, and that the most helpful tool in navigating those relationships and all of the imperfections that come with them is empathy. Academically, I first learned about empathy the next year in school. My class watched a TED Talk by Brené Brown, who is known for her nearly 2 decades of experience and study on vulnerability, encouragement, shame, and empathy. The video focuses on the distinction between sympathy and empathy, the challenges of sympathizing with someone, and the power of employing empathy. Brown uses the analogy of being in a deep hole. Someone who sympathizes with you will look down into the hole and try to find a silver lining in your situation. Someone who empathizes with you will climb down into the hole and be vulnerable with you. Brown references nursing scholar Teresa Wiseman and the 4 qualities of empathy: perspective taking, staying out of judgment, recognizing emotion in other people, and communicating that. Empathy is feeling with someone. Sympathy is feeling for someone. That year in my class, we focused on how to use empathy with other students, how to understand other people's situations, how to be a good friend, and ultimately, how to maintain relationships with our peers. I think that because of this, I only really associated the word empathy with others my age. How could I empathize with my parents, my teachers, or other adults in my life when we didn't have the same experiences? But I realized adults are actually some of the most important people that we, as adolescents, need to empathize with. Why? Because they have one of the most critical jobs in the lives of the children they encounter. They have to show us right from wrong and be role models for the people that we will become. That's a lot of pressure. Imagine if you knew that everything you did would be viewed as a blueprint for how the future generations would act. Scary, right? It's at that moment that we realize that our support system needs support of its own. And yet the world still expects that at some undefined age, we all just figure it out. We'll have all the answers. We'll know what to do. Well, let me tell you, this is not the case. These adults work hard for us. They deserve our empathy. There are 2 types of empathy we can provide. Cognitive empathy, which uses critical thinking to understand the thoughts and feelings of another person. And emotional empathy, where we can understand the emotions of another person because we've had those same feelings and experiences ourselves. As young people, we most likely think of empathy as the emotional kind. Empathizing with adults is challenging because it involves mostly cognitive empathy, where we must create inherently imperfect analogies to try to relate their struggles to our own experiences. This is something I might have done with my teacher during our cyberbullying case, had I known how. Cognitive empathy allows us to see through a third eye, one that can understand the complexities of a situation and all of the difficulty that comes with trying to manage it. It's then that we realize that adults are trying to figure out how to do everything in very much the same way that we are. But empathy is not a one and done. It's not something you master on the first try. It's a skill you practice and must work at deliberately so that it becomes second nature. If we're able to effectively empathize with ourselves, as well as the adults in our lives, be they teachers, parents, or bosses, we strengthen the bonds we have with them and can begin to understand each other on a deeper level. So I want to ask you all again, how many of you think you hold the adults in your life to a nearly impossible standard? My challenge to all of you is to use empathy to change that. Thank you.